that it doesn't originate with Christianity. It originates, Jesus is pulling on the Old Testament prophets. It originates with Judaism. What Christianity did is it took over the world. And so this Jewish idea of love your neighbor as yourself became a dominant paradigm.
And obviously it takes a long time, like yeast working through dough, like the mustard seed growing, until we get modern ideas of equality. But I think very specifically, these have come from biblical and particularly Christian foundations.
According to the biblical record. And this is the consistent motif throughout the Bible, is that women are to be subordinate to men. There are, it's massively evident when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament.
Where do we get the idea for human rights and human equality? You cannot cut open a human being and discover in their DNA human equality. It's not the sort of thing that Plato or Aristotle believed in. Of course, there are citizens and there are barbarians, and there are males and there are females, and there are slaves and there are free people, and we live within a hierarchy. And as Bart has already said about the paterfamilias, there is a person at the top of that hierarchy who is in this priestly role, who has incredible rights over the lives and bodies of everyone else, within that structure. And I guess I begin the book with equality because I want to go back to Genesis 1 and say on page 1 in the beginning we've got male and female in God's image to have dominion over the world. And I think that's a radically different creation account to the ancient Near Eastern accounts, to the Greek and Roman myths, to the Egyptian myths, in which there are chaotic forces at play and humanity are made as slaves for the gods. And in Genesis 1, you've got humanity as having dominion. It's God's world, but he puts humans in charge. So you have this incredible dignity that is given to the human person. And one of the people I reference in the book is Celsus in the 2nd century, a great critic of Christianity, who talks about the radical error of Jews and Christians. And radical error number 1 is this Hebrew idea that God uniquely blesses humans. Why should that be the case? Mm-hmm. But that radical error is compounded by the Christians who come along and say, not only does God uniquely bless humans, God uniquely becomes human in the person of Jesus. And so you've got this foundation for humanism in God the human. And no wonder you can get the Apostle Paul coming along later in Galatians and saying there's no male, nor female, slave, nor free, Jew nor Gentile, because we're all one in Christ Jesus. Modeled within the church, you start to get this idea of a different kind of family in which everyone, no matter their station, is a brother or a sister, and no one is Lord except Christ. And obviously it takes a long time, like yeast working through dough, like the mustard seed growing, until we get modern ideas of equality. But I think very specifically these have come from biblical and particularly Christian foundations.
Glenn points to Genesis and early Christian teachings as the foundation of equality. But that doesn't hold up when we look at the facts. The Bible, both Old and New Testament, clearly supports slavery, patriarchal dominance, and the subordination of women. In Exodus 21, slave ownership is explicitly regulated, not condemned. In the New Testament, Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. He doesn't call for abolition. Women are told to remain silent and submit. This isn't hidden. It was used to justify inequality for centuries. Christian empires ran the transatlantic slave trade. The church opposed women's suffrage. Even the idea of consent in marriage wasn't accepted until secular law overrode religious norms. The real turning point came during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Mary Wollstonecraft challenged religious authority and pushed ideas of freedom, equality, and universal rights, based on reason, not scripture. So no, modern human rights didn't come from Christianity. They emerged in spite of it, through centuries of struggle against the very hierarchies religion helped build. Let's hear what Bart has to say about that.
When you go back to the creation stories, I think the most troubling thing is not Genesis 1, but Genesis 2, when you have the detailed description. I assume you're talking about the equality of humans, because Genesis 1 is not about equality of living beings, because the whole point is humans have the entire creation to be subordinate to humans.
Dominion.
And so the question is, are men and women created equally? And I get your point from Genesis 1. When you have the account in Genesis 2 about how it actually happens, God first makes Adam and makes Adam a living being, and then Adam needs a helper, and so he creates all the animals, and these are to be his helpers. But it turns out there's no one suitable, so he makes a woman out of the man, an isha out of the ish in Hebrew, and she's to be his helper, his helpmate. That's why she exists. He does not come into being to help her. She comes into being to help him, and then she leads him astray, according to the biblical record. And this is the consistent motif throughout the Bible, is that women are to be subordinate to men. It's massively evident when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And when in the New Testament, where you have somebody pick up this story from Genesis 2, it's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where the author, claiming to be Paul, says that women are not to talk in church. They're to exercise no authority over a man. They're to be subject to men, because Eve was misled, not Adam. And this is what happens when women teach. They get misled by the devil and they lead the man astray. You get a similar thing in Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 14 about women are not to talk in church. So it's true that Galatians does say that in Christ there's no male or female or slave or free, and that's absolutely true, and it's absolutely important that he says that. But the two key words are in Christ. What he means is that everybody equally gets salvation. But Paul does not think that they are equal in the church. He tells the women in Corinth that they are to be subject to their husbands, just as the husbands are subject to God. And so the husband is their God. And so this is not equality on any social level. And if you look at the history of Christianity, I don't think anyone would look at the history of Christianity through late antiquity or the Middle Ages into the Reformation and would think that Christianity supported equality for all human beings. They simply didn't. It's not until the Enlightenment that comes about. And the people who developed this in the Enlightenment were not always Christians. In fact, most of them weren't Christian in any sense that you would recognize. And so you have I would agree, you have kind of the roots there. You have the roots in also other forms of ancient thought, though. I don't know if you've looked into Stoicism, but in the Stoic world also you have various traces of this. And so the Enlightenment does have earlier traces, but I don't think it's an exclusively Christian concept, and I don't think it's a particularly Christian concept, because in fact Christianity supports subordination, not equality.
Okay. Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we might need the 7 hours. Okay. So the fact that Adam comes first within the Genesis narrative means that he is more primitive, because we go from very simple things in Genesis to much more complex things. And in terms of Adam, we go from dust to man to woman. And if Adam is the head of creation, Eve is the crown. And so I think if you just follow literarily what is going on in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't get the sense of Eve being a lesser, but actually a more developed creature than Adam is. And the fact that she is the helper, the Ezer, is that, God is most commonly spoken of as our help, in that we cannot live without him. We need help. We desperately need help. And so the helper does not mean it's a diminutive role at all, I would say. And then it's interesting where does the feminist impulse come from? And you have said that Galatians is very important in that. I would say the treatment of women by Christ was radically countercultural in the day. that the marriage and family program, as Joseph Henrich has put the sort of the early church sexual ethic of the day, was radically equalizing in terms of its expectations of men and women. I get into this in my consent chapter, that if the sexual revolution of the 1960s equalized the sexes by saying women can be as freed as men have always been sexually, the first century sexual revolution was basically men must be as restricted as women have always been. And in a sense, very, very few things I would say have ever been as liberating for women and children than that first century sexual revolution, in which men are utterly restricted to the levels of modesty and chastity that were always expected of women. And I'm not saying that in the first century we have a fully blown sense of the UN Declaration of Human Rights or of any of that, but I am saying that exclusively and particularly it is a Christian understanding that is developing. And then when you get into the idea of, did these ideas come from the Enlightenment? I tend to think that that's more a creationist narrative, that sort of out of nowhere has come these ideas of equality without a backstory. And I would just encourage people to be more evolutionary in their thinking, in a theistic sense, that actually what was developed through the Enlightenment and on into the modern world were foundationally Christian views that I don't think you would get without those Christian foundations.
I mean, what do you just quickly say to the Bart saying the concept of equality was also floating around in Stoicism and other ancient forms of thought and philosophy? Perhaps it was just Christianity that kind of was the vehicle that really, took it forward eventually because of the triumph of Christianity. But do you think it was there otherwise, Glenn?
You can point to all sorts of things that we look back now through glasses and through a prism that can point out things in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures that we can applaud, including any traces of equality that we see in Stoicism. I guess my question would be, why are we looking for those particular things? And I would say that the reason we're looking for those particular things is we're coming from an irreducibly Christian mindset that is looking for those particular things.
So can I respond to some of that, Justin?
Please.
I mean, I don't think it's irreducibly Christian, because if you're going to do an evolutionary model, of course, Christianity came out of other things too. It's not really fair to isolate Christianity, for example, apart from Judaism. And so you could just as well write the book saying that it's not a Christian model, it's a Jewish model. So I think that the lens you're looking at as a Christian theologian is Christianity, but if you look at it historically, I don't think it works. When you look, and I don't think the Enlightenment came out of nowhere at all. I think there definitely were roots, and some of them were Christian and some weren't. As to Adam and Eve, though, I've got to say I don't think the logic works. I love the idea that Eve is the pinnacle. That God saved the best for last. That's great. But if you follow that logic, what you're saying is, first God creates the other animals to help Adam. And if he's more primitive than Eve because he was first, that means he's more primitive than the animals, which means that spiders and snakes and aardvarks are superior to humans in that scheme.
The animals are already there. He just hadn't named them.
No, God made them in order to help him. That's why he made.
God brought the animals to him, but the animals are created.
The animals are created, at least in the first chapter of Genesis. The animals get created on whatever is day 4 or 5.
I'm not talking about the first. As you know, look, this is another long issue. But Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different stories. Eve does not show up in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2, and Glenn is presupposing Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, when he says that Eve came second. So I'm talking about what he's talking about, Eve coming second. She doesn't come second, she comes after the animals. And so if she's superior to Adam because she was made as his helper, the animals are made as his helpers.
They're not made. They were brought to him. They were brought to him. They weren't made. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. That God makes the animals in order to help Adam. He names them, but they're only after they're made.
Bart's completely right to highlight that Genesis 2 is deeply rooted in hierarchy, not equality. And the proof isn't just in the story, It's in how that story was used for centuries to justify male dominance and female subordination in Christian doctrine, law, and society. Take 1 Timothy 2:11-15, used for over 1,800 years to deny women leadership, silence them in church, and justify that their nature is more easily deceived. This wasn't fringe theology, it was mainstream. Influential figures like Augustine, Tertullian, and Aquinas all reinforced the idea that women were inferior by nature. Aquinas even wrote that women are defective and misbegotten men, a conclusion drawn straight from Christian interpretations of Genesis. The idea that Jesus introduced gender equality doesn't match the facts. There's no gospel record of Jesus calling for the end of patriarchy or slavery. He didn't challenge the legal inferiority of women, or say anything about women's rights to divorce, own property, or testify in court. Things women in Roman society were often denied. Glenn's claim that the early church equalized sexual expectations between men and women is misleading. The early Christian sexual ethic wasn't about freedom or fairness. It was about control, especially over women's bodies. Church fathers idealized virginity and celibacy, especially for women, and viewed sex even in marriage as suspect. Jerome, one of Christianity's most influential thinkers, said, "Nothing is so unclean as a woman's body." That's not a foundation of equality. That's institutional misogyny. And the idea that Christianity slowly evolved into modern human rights is revisionist. Real legal equality and consent laws didn't emerge from churches. They were won against the churches by secular thinkers during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment didn't come out of nowhere, but its core principles, freedom of thought, bodily autonomy, equality before the law, often clashed with Christian orthodoxy. Thinkers like Spinoza, Hume, Voltaire, and Paine questioned divine authority and rooted human rights in reason and shared experience, not in divine revelation. That's where real equality began to take legal shape. Christian institutions resisted these ideas, sometimes violently. And even the idea of consent in marriage. The church didn't teach that marital rape was wrong until the late 20th century. In fact, marital rape was legal in most Christian countries until feminist, secular movements challenged the doctrine that wives owed sex to their husbands, a view grounded in centuries of Christian theology. So Glenn's idea that Christianity planted the seeds of equality just doesn't hold up. What history shows is that Christianity institutionalized hierarchy, and that human equality had to be wrestled out of its grip by people brave enough to question its authority.
Let's start with you here. Why do you believe that Christianity did give us that sense? And then we'll see what Bart has to say.
I think there is kindness and there's compassion in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures. So it's like I don't want to be heard to say that Christianity has a monopoly on kindness, on tender-heartedness, on love. But I think there is something unique about the highest becoming the lowest on the cross, in order that we, the lowest, might be brought into his hospitality. You know, if the way of all nature is the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest, the Christian story is the sacrifice of the fittest, Christ, so that we, the weakest, might survive. And I think whereas in the realm of nature it is tit for tat, in the realm of nature it is nature red in tooth and claw, there is something supernatural about the way of Christ. There's something against nature. There is something that says, I will protect the weakest. And obviously it was something that a critic of the church like Nietzsche hated. He saw the cross as the transvaluation of all values. Because, of course, nature teaches us that the weak, the low, and the botched should perish, and we shall help them to do so, he says in the Antichrist. And therefore, Christians have always, he thought, stood in the way of a proper humanitarian ideal. And the proper humanitarian ideal is we can all fly off to become Übermensch. We can all fly off to greater heights of humanity if we let the poor, the weak, the low, and the botched, as he called them, perish, so that we can, evolve to a higher degree. I think the revulsion that we feel at that sentiment is a particularly Christian revulsion, and it is born of some particularly Christian intuitions. I think we've been looking at a picture of the Lord on the cross for thousands of years, and we have held that up as our image of what it is to be great. And whoever will be greatest among you must serve, and the first shall be last, and all that kind of stuff that Jesus taught. I think we have been formed, whether we've been to church or not, all of us have been formed by an image of greatness in sacrifice, and even shameful sacrifice on the cross for the sake of the other, which I think gives a bite to a Christian understanding of compassion.
And how, just before we come back to Bart, was that, in your view, shown in practical ways by the early Christian church?
Hospitals, for instance, would be an interesting place to go. Now that the Greeks had their manuals of how Galen's four humours and how to be a physician and to help people, and the Romans had their sort of sick bays for the slaves and the soldiers, but that was to restore them to economic and military fruitfulness. The idea of hospitals for the weak and the poor and the sick who could not afford it became a very much a Christian thing that happened, and there was a cascade of hospitals that sort of happened from the 4th century onwards. Would be one kind of thing, or standing against abortion and infanticide, and not simply standing against abortion and infanticide, but taking the exposed infants and raising them in orphan care and that sort of thing. That would be another way of actually standing against the way of nature.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Bart, that in those pagan cultures, it was legal, essentially, to abandon and expose, as it was called, infants who were unwanted economically, or because they were malformed or whatever it was. And as I understand it, Christians became to be known for people who would go to those places where they were traditionally left and took them in and adopted them and so on. For this is a part of a big picture that Glenn believes goes back to this idea of the God who was willing to be sacrificed and kind of upheld the poor and the lowly and so on over the powerful. What's your view on that as being the kind of the linchpin for where this central virtue of compassion as a value came from in Western culture?
I've got two things to say about it. One is this is the one area of Glenn's book that I completely agree with in most ways. I would put it differently. The way not contradictorily, it's just a different way. My different way of thinking about it is, I actually deal with this in this book that just came out with Yale about my journeys to the afterlife, because some of them deal with these issues and the issue is that in the Roman world generally, the ancient world generally, the world generally, the ideology was one of dominance. That whoever was dominant, there were no ethical problems with a person who was dominating somebody. That's what they were supposed to do. And so a powerful village there was no ethical problem with destroying the village next door, killing all the men and enslaving all the women. There wasn't an ethical problem with that. Or empires. And so you can read through the moral discourses of Romans and Greeks, and they don't problematize that. They don't problematize slavery. Of course, I mean, the master is supposed to be master of the slave, and so slavery is fine. Yeah, of course. They're usually prisoners of war in the ancient world. It wasn't a race thing. It was just, you enslave people. And men were to dominate women economically, socially, culturally, politically, sexually. And so it was all domination, and Jesus preached service. And it was completely contrary to what the dominant paradigm was that you're to serve others and to live for and to help the poor. And that's when, in the ancient world, if you had a lot of money and if you had to give some away or you did give some away, it was always to somebody on your same socioeconomic class, or to build a public building, or to put on a gladiatorial show or something like. It was for your own, to promote your own status. The idea of helping the poor was like unheard of. It's like, are you kidding me? That's a joke. No, you're not going to help the poor. And so I completely agree with that is a paradigm shift. It's not the case that everybody accepted the paradigm. A lot of Christians were going around saying, yeah, Jesus said to sell everything. He didn't really mean it. And so, you get a lot of that, and people are people. But you do get the shift in how preachers preached it. The other thing I would say, though, is that it doesn't originate with Christianity. It originates, Jesus is pulling on the Old Testament prophets. It originates with Judaism. What Christianity did is it took over the world. And so this Jewish idea of love your neighbor as yourself became a dominant paradigm in the West, at least theoretically, because of Christianity. I agree with that. And it's true, you get hospitals and you get orphanages and you get the weird idea that you're concerned about the destitute. Ancient pagans talk about it and they say, what? No, we're not doing that.
Bart makes two important points here, and they both stand up to history. First, the idea that caring for the poor and weak was some radical new Christian invention just isn't true. That moral shift began long before Jesus, in Judaism through prophets like Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, who condemned the rich for exploiting the poor and called on the people to care for widows, orphans, and the oppressed. Jesus was teaching in that tradition, not creating something new. Second, even when Christianity became dominant, it didn't consistently follow its own ideals. Yes, some Christians rescued infants, built hospitals, and preached compassion. But these were exceptions, not norms. For most of church history, the poor were still exploited, slavery was normalized, and church institutions amassed enormous wealth while preaching humility. Even monastic hospitals, which Glenn praises, were often limited to serving other Christians, sometimes only clergy, and could exclude the very people Jesus supposedly came to help. The compassion that survived did so because people, not institutions, fought to keep it alive. And let's not forget, many non-Christian cultures also built systems of care. In India, Buddhist monastic hospitals predate Christian ones. In China, Confucian ethics promoted caring for the vulnerable. The idea that only Christianity cared for the weak is not just inaccurate, it's dismissive of the full human story. Bart is right. Christianity spread a Jewish ethic, but it didn't originate it, and it often failed to practice it. The values we hold today, compassion, consent, equality, were won through a long, difficult evolution, often in spite of religion, not because of it. What do you think? Do you believe religion is necessary for morality, or can human values grow without it?
You both think or believe will happen after you die?
I imagine my wife will get married to somebody else, and no, actually, she's going to run off with a friend of hers and have a whole bunch of cats. Oh, you mean what's going to happen to me? I don't know. I don't see any reason to think that anything's going to happen to me. Everything that makes me me, everything that we have historically and religiously attributed to a soul that can be identified with a place, just has a place in the brain. My personality is in my brain. We know from experiments on people who have suffered all sorts of brain damage that you can reset people's personality, their preference, their memories, their ability to make new memories. I'm going to get the name wrong. Vishwanathan. Somebody will know. Anyway, did a talk at one of the religion summits about a split brain patient, hemispherectomy. They can communicate with both halves, and each half has a separate personality and a separate identity and communicates independently. One half, Christian. The other half, atheist. Now, I guess you could argue that when we split that brain in half, there was only enough soul for one side, and the other side just got, shafted. But everything we know about what makes us us, our likes, our preferences, our desires, they're all a product of the brain. Now, a lot of theists would say that there's a soul behind it all, as a puppet master, the ghost in the machine. And yet there's no evidence to support this. And it doesn't make sense in the model. If I suffer severe brain damage and all of a sudden I don't remember the past, I don't remember that I love my wife, I don't like the same foods, I don't want to interact with the same people, and now all of a sudden I believe in God, am I the same person? I don't think so. Haven't we really kind of ended up with a whole new person? I have an argument that I use partially as a joke. It's an argument that demonstrates, according to some traditions, nobody's in heaven, and it's really easy. In heaven, there's no suffering and no sadness, according to some traditions. My mom is convinced she's going to heaven. She's convinced I'm going to hell. I don't know who's going to end up in heaven, but it won't be my mom. There's no way my mom could be up in heaven, not suffering and not sad that her son is in hell. And if God does some kind of magic to take that out of her, it's not my mom anymore. It's a facsimile of my mom. Some kind of robotic worshiping thing that's not my mom. My mom and I disagree vehemently on religious stuff, so much so we don't talk about it anymore because we love each other. We'd like to have a civil, Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever religious holiday drives me up there to visit and hang out. By the way, we celebrate Christmas, have a big white tree with peppermints and stuff on it. It's awesome. Entirely secular stuff. We're stealing it back because Christianity stole most of those things from other religions. And Easter too, but I'm not that big on eggs and candy because I'm diabetic. But everything that we know about us takes place in our brain. The brain gets damaged. Are you the same person? I don't know. The math on souls is confusing. Sam Harris has talked about the math on souls for people who believe that zygotes get a soul because the embryo will sometimes split and then we get together. So when it splits, does it have two souls? And then when it comes back together, does it just have one? Or now do we have a body with two souls? Or did we not put a soul in until afterwards? Or does it happen when he breathes his first breath, as the Jews believed? It doesn't make any sense. The math on souls doesn't make sense. The science on souls doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to think that there's some kind of ghost dictating what goes on in my brain. We haven't even gotten into free will. Cliff keeps asserting that we have it. I'm not convinced we do, at least not in the sense that he's talking about. I don't know what's going to happen to me when I'm dead. I'm pretty sure my body's going to rot, my brain's going to stop working, and I will cease to exist. And it didn't bother me before I was alive, so I don't see what bothered me afterwards.
When Matt says everything we are, our thoughts, memories, personality, comes from the brain, he's not just guessing. We have real evidence for that. Brain scans show that damage to specific areas can completely change how a person behaves. People with strokes or brain injuries sometimes lose their ability to recognize loved ones, form memories, or even control their emotions. There's also the famous case of split brain patients. When the brain is divided, each half can act like its own person, sometimes with completely different beliefs. If a soul were running the show, how does that even make sense? Matt brings up a good point about heaven, too. If someone you love goes to hell, but you're not sad in heaven, are you really you anymore? It sounds more like a version of you with your emotions turned off. That's not comforting. It's unsettling. And scientifically, we've never found any evidence of a soul. No energy, no signal, no mechanism. It's all based on belief, not observation. Now, let's hear what Cliff has to say about this.
Guys, we got to be honest with each other. If there is no God, we know exactly what happens when we die. If there is no God, there's no life after death. If there is no God, you are matter and energy. And when you die, the matter and energy fall apart. So let's not act like maybe there's life after death. No, that's illogical. If there is no God, when you die, when I die, we become fertilizer. Very logical, very reasonable. But you know what the problem is? The problem is that I've got to do funerals for families that are atheist or agnostic. Inevitably, what happens to me is I'm standing there and they're coming up to me saying, well, maybe the Great Spirit. Excuse me? Great Spirit? What are you talking about? If there is no God, there's no spirit. There's matter and energy. And when we die, the matter and energy falls apart. Now, don't get scared. Just face reality. Be objective. And don't allow your fears to get you knocking your knees saying, oh, well, maybe. Oh, well, possibly. No. Be rational. Use your good mind. If there is no God, when you die, you rot. When I die, I rot. End of story. Just think about it. Now, there's an alternative to that. And the alternative is that if there's a supernatural God, then possibly there is life after death. And I can promise you, I would never believe there's life after death because I'm scared to die. That's being a wimp. That's being a coward. Instead, you'd better use your brain and you better start thinking And you better figure out, does the evidence point to there being something more to reality than matter and energy, there being some type of God, or does there not? And then secondly, you better use your brain and you better think real clearly. Does the historical evidence point to Jesus having died and risen from the dead or not? And I can promise you, if you believe there's life after death because you're scared to die, you're an intellectual wimp. And I would never believe there's life after death because I find it attractive. And Matt is wrong. I don't believe there's life after death because I've got this deep longing for life after death. But I'll tell you exactly what I do. If I find that I have a deep longing for something, I look at the evidence to find out, is there any truth to it or not? And if there's no truth to it, I drop it. But if there is evidence to support it, I would be very wise to follow that evidence. Now, why do I believe there's life after death? First of all, because the evidence says there is a supernatural God. And second of all, because the historical evidence is that Jesus was dead, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And the people who saw him risen from the dead died for, not for belief, they died for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. If you claim to have seen something, like Matthew, Mark, John, Thomas, Philip, Andrew, Peter, if you claim to have seen the dead Christ risen from the dead, and then you stand before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers say Caesar is Lord and live, or else maintain that your Jesus is risen from the dead, and we will execute you for it. And if you stand there and say, I'm sorry, I've seen Jesus risen from the dead, that gives your claim tremendous credibility. So the evidence is Jesus rose from the dead. That's why I'm convinced when he promises you eternal life, if you trust in him, he ain't blowing smoke. He's speaking the truth.
Cliff says if there's no God, we just rot. That part is true. What he gets wrong is assuming that's a problem. Just because the idea of death is uncomfortable doesn't make something else magically true. That's not evidence. That's wishful thinking. He also says people died for what they saw, as if martyrdom proves truth. But people die for all kinds of beliefs. Muslims, Hindus, even cult members like Heaven's Gate. Dying for something doesn't prove it's real. It just shows how strongly someone believed it. Cliff brings up Jesus' resurrection like it's a historical fact, but we don't have first-hand evidence. The Gospels were written decades later, anonymously, and contradict each other in key details. That's not strong historical data. It's hearsay. Hitchens was right to say, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so far, Cliff hasn't given any evidence, just emotional appeals and stories written down 2,000 years ago. Let's hear Matt one more time.
One is this continued objection to, without God, there's no ultimate meaning. There's no real purpose. Well, I don't know what you mean by real purpose. That seems kind of cheaty. But as far as ultimate meaning, yes, I agree. No ultimate meaning in the existential sense that you're talking about it. And it doesn't matter one bit. The car that I've got out there parked in the parking lot, I've had for a couple of years. One of these days, it's going to rot away. Does that mean it's not valuable now? Does that mean it doesn't have any value to me now? Does it mean there's no purpose? Should I just go ahead and chuck it now? Let's get rid of it. Eventually, it's going to be useless. That's absurd. We all recognize that things have meaning and purpose right now because they are valuable to us. These are properties that we imbue things with and we imbue people with. Do I matter as much to you as your spouse? Bet you I don't, unless it's you. This idea that without the ultimate meaning, or if something is ultimately meaningless, doesn't mean it is always meaningless, or it doesn't mean it's meaningless in every way. This idea about morality, that it's all relative. Actually, I'm a staunch defender of absolute morality. And despite Cliff's straw man, I'm not saying that slavery is immoral because I said so. It might surprise some people to know that while I don't think there's intrinsic value, I think that there is value in people, and that's the value that we imbue them with. This idea that because I said so is the basis for secular morality is flatly absurd. It's the exact opposite of what I just finished talking about how you go through and you build up this system. We are physical beings in a physical universe that follows physical laws. There are truths to be discovered about how our actions benefit us and how our actions harm us. This is simply true. We don't need another mind. This is about the interaction of minds, but we don't need some transcendent mind to dictate what is true. We discover what is true about the reality that we inhabit. God or not, soul or not, we can choose everything on the list that Cliff just talked about being good to each other and building a productive society and caring and loving and trying to end poverty, trying to end oppression, and trying to build a better society. We can do all of that just because it's the right thing to do. There's no evidence for a soul. In fact, there's good evidence against it. There's no evidence, or not enough evidence, of the various God claims that are out there, or not any particularly good evidence, at least that I've been made aware of. But I could be wrong. And tomorrow, I could find out that there is a God and that I do have a soul. And it wouldn't change very much for me as far as how I end up living my life, because I've already come to good reasons to do things. I'm open to being corrected on them, but what's going to correct me is reason and evidence, not appealing to a God. And if people ask me, well, what are you going to do if you die and you end up standing before God? Hey, I tried. I used my brain. I followed the evidence where it was. And by the way, if your character is actually accurately depicted in the Bible or the Quran, I don't want nothing to do with you. I'm already morally superior to you. I already care more about people than you do. I know. I've never sanctioned slavery, never sanctioned genocide. Gods have. Do all religions lead to the same God? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I think they clearly all define God differently. I think you could go right down into the same church on the same pew and get two different people, and they're going to define God differently, and they're going to have different views of God. I think there's as many different religions as there are people trying to practice them. And my concern isn't whether or not they all lead to the same God. It's what kind of world do they end up creating? Because why should I care about an afterlife that I don't know whether or not it exists when I've got a life that I know that I have, and I'd like to make it better? And if your religion is impeding on the ability of people who don't practice your religion, or those who do, from living the best life they can right now, then your religion's a problem. That goes for Islam and Christianity and Scientology and Hinduism and everything. If you're advocating something that is detracting from the good of this world, you're part of the problem.
Does being an atheist require the same faith that believing in God does?
No, seriously. It doesn't require any faith to not believe something. It doesn't. Now, if atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, ooh, I pissed some people off. If atheism was this assertion that there are no gods, well, then, yes, you might be able to make a case that that was based on faith, or maybe it's not. It would depend on what the basis, what the foundation for that particular belief was. But atheism, in the weak atheism sense of I do not believe this, doesn't require faith. I don't believe there's a Bigfoot. That's not a faith. It's not a faith-based position. I'm not asserting certainty that there isn't a Bigfoot. I'm just not yet convinced. The Bigfoot claim hasn't met its burden of proof. Neither have alien abductions, which, by the way, I'll point out, you can actually go talk to real living people right now who will tell you their alien abduction story. Living, breathing people, you can talk to them. They will have stories that are similar in detail. In some cases, there are multiple people who have supposedly experienced this together. In some cases, the things that people have seen have been entire small towns. And you can interview these people. How many people think that they're actually being abducted by aliens? Not me. And that's people you can talk to right now. Somebody writes a couple books, in a couple thousand years, somebody could stand up and say, hey, look, I wouldn't believe it, but look at all of these accounts. These are firsthand people. They were interviewed by the news. We have a much better record of what was happening at the end of the 20th and beginning of 21st century than we do about what happened back when Jesus was supposedly alive, or back around the time that Hinduism was being formed. This is a real record. We even have video footage of people talking about how they came down. And then they'll start tying it together in an intricate little web, the same way conspiracy theorists do right now. Oh, there were lizard people in the government or crop circles out there. We don't believe any of that, I hope. I am at Texas State. I kind of respect you guys because I don't care about colleges, so we're not in any rivalry. UT. But we don't believe that. Why should we? And yet we're expected to believe what is potentially a more extraordinary claim and weaker evidence. There's nothing particularly extraordinary about a universe that's billions, 13.7 billion years old, that there might be some other life somewhere. I don't know. Probably unlikely they made it this far. No reason for them to pick out Earth because we're not special, despite what many creationists would have you believe. They've got this wily coyote god who straps on a hat and balances on a wire and goes through all...
Matt makes a powerful case here. You don't need God to have meaning, purpose, or morality, and science backs him up. Studies in neuroscience, psychology, and evolutionary biology show that humans are wired for empathy, cooperation, and moral reasoning. Not because of religion, but because these traits helped us survive and thrive as social beings. Purpose doesn't have to come from some ultimate source to be real. It can come from love, family, creativity, curiosity, things we build and share. Just because something ends doesn't mean it was worthless. That's true for life, relationships, and even a good story. As for morality, Matt's right again. Objective moral systems can be built without appealing to a higher power. We observe the consequences of our actions. We learn what causes harm and what creates well-being. That's reason. That's evidence. And that's enough. Matt doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just refuses to accept bad ones. He's willing to change his mind, but only for a good reason. That's intellectual honesty. And that's the foundation for a better world. So here's the question. If the life you're living now is the only one you're sure you have, what are you doing to make it count? Like this video if you found it thought-provoking. Subscribe for more honest debates and evidence-based commentary.
But is the historical issue here then that you think that this claim that the Messiah had been raised was kind of a post facto kind of sort of rationalization of these experiences they had?
They thought he was the Messiah before he died, in my judgment.
Right, so they did think he was the Messiah.
They weren't expecting him to die.
Right.
He died. One of them, two of them, three of them said, "I've seen the Lord." And then they had to figure out, well, how does that work? And it must mean, if he's alive again, it must mean that God's raised him from the dead.
But there were other...
These are apocalyptic Jews. Apocalyptic Jews, the only way they can imagine life after death is an embodied existence. They don't believe the soul lives on after death. These are Jews. Jews believe that the body and soul are one thing, and that afterlife, if there is an afterlife, it's body and soul. No, that if they see Jesus alive afterwards, it must mean that his soul has come back into his body. How does that happen? It can only happen when God does it.
Okay.
God has raised him from the dead. Once they say they raised him from the dead and they already knew he was the Messiah, that's when they start saying the Messiah was raised.
Quick response and we'll go to a break and then we'll carry
I was just going to say, but there's other categories that they could have, as Jews, thought of. The Maccabees died horrible deaths and they believed they lived on, exalted in the heaven. And they, you have many other examples of this kind of disembodied continuing to live on, but they will rise again at the final resurrection. But what the early Christians said is that Jesus had risen again now. The resurrection had already begun. Bart agrees with that. But where did that idea come from? That's the unexpectedness.
Yeah, it came from
completely unexpected. Right. But you're saying they put it together. You're saying they're the geniuses who put this innovative, unparalleled idea that has changed the world. That all goes back to the brain of Mary Magdalene?
I'm changing the world has nothing to do with it. The issue is, what does an apocalyptic Jew...
It did change the world, though, right?
What does an apocalyptic Jew think if they see somebody who had died, who's alive now? Now, when you see your grandmother in your bedroom 2 weeks after she died, typically today, this happens a lot, 1 out of 8 people in our country have a vision of a deceased loved one and are convinced they're alive again or that they're alive. In our context, we believe that the body and the soul are separable, and the soul lives on afterwards. So when you see your grandmother in your bedroom, as 1 out of 8 people, not necessarily your grandmother, but some beloved one, typically what you think is their soul's gone to heaven, they've come down to visit me, because that's our mentality of an afterlife.
But
apocalypticists don't have that They don't have that view. Their view is that if somebody's alive after they died, it has to be a resurrection because the soul doesn't exist outside the body. So when they see Jesus, he's got to have a soul back in the body, which means God has raised him from the dead. That's the first thing they know, and they don't have any theology about it. It's just, oh my God, he's come back from the dead, and then they work it out.
Quick response, and we'll go to our break.
No, Josephus, for example, definitely believes souls exist.
He's not an
outside.
apocalyptic Jew.
Well, why not?
He's anti-apocalyptic. I don't know if you've studied Josephus. Josephus is famously anti-apocalyptic. We're talking about apocalyptic Jews.
Bart assumes that they just saw something, but he hasn't explained to us what they saw. And whatever they saw changed their complete worldview.
I don't know what you see when you see your grandmother either.
Okay, but I definitely don't say she's raised from the dead.
You say she's still alive.
Well, but she's still dead, though, right?
In Jesus' case, my point is...
in our case, if you're going to use that parallel, in our case, when we see someone in the afterlife, yes, we think they're still alive in heaven, but we say they're dead here on earth.
We say their body is dead.
That's not what the early Christians said.
That's right.
They said Jesus had risen from the dead.
Right. So you need to listen. A
crucified man had risen from the dead.
Yes, you need to listen to why that is. We say their body is dead and their soul is alive because we believe in the difference between the body and the soul. Apocalyptic Jews did not. They could not say that his soul is still living because his body can't be alive unless his soul comes back into it. They don't have our view of the separation of body.
I disagree with you.
Well, look, we're going to take a break there.
Really?
We're going to take a break.
Okay, tell me some.
When a few early followers said they saw Jesus after his death, that alone doesn't prove a resurrection. Psychological studies show that grief hallucinations are incredibly common. About 13% of bereaved people report vivid visions of deceased loved ones. These aren't random. They're often shaped by cultural expectations. And for apocalyptic Jews, the group Jesus and his followers belong to, resurrection didn't mean a ghost or a soul in heaven. It meant bodily revival. Their worldview didn't support the idea of a disembodied soul living on. So if someone thought they saw Jesus, they interpreted it as a physical resurrection. Not because it happened, but because they had no other framework for understanding that experience. This isn't speculation. Jewish texts like the Book of Daniel show their belief in a future bodily resurrection, not some eternal spirit world. And when Paul writes decades later, even he never describes seeing a physical Jesus, only a revelation or vision. That suggests the original resurrection claim likely started with grief-induced visions, not an empty tomb.
Just add, Bart says this is happening all the time. Where does someone project an enemy apparition? What example
it happens
do you have?
sometimes. If you feel guilty, for example, if you feel guilty about what you've done to somebody leading to...
Give me an example.
Well, if you read the psychological literature on visions, you actually find a good bit of it.
Anything specific?
Well, they aren't names that you would... They're just people. I mean, they're just people,
Pretty sure.
Not
in the literature. Not in the literature. No.
Okay, well, I suggest you read it.
There is no projection of enemies in the literature. Dale Allison would
yeah. So
correct you on that.
what I'd say is that some people have hypothesized that Paul felt very guilty, or that Peter felt very guilty about his denial of Jesus, and that he started out, and so because of his guilt, he saw something. It's very common. One of the most common reasons for seeing a bereaved loved one is because you felt like you mistreated them before they died, and the guilt creates and so.
But again, that doesn't guarantee saying an unparalleled claim of resurrection of a Messiah that was crucified. He could have felt like he forgave him, but it doesn't mean he would have said that.
And not only that, but I've never said it did. And so that isn't my claim.
You said that's what caused Peter's claim.
Peter did not...
He didn't claim Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay. What I've been saying is Peter did not claim that the Messiah got raised from the dead the second he saw Jesus. What he thought was Jesus had come back to life.
You're saying he figured it out as an apocalyptic Jew. I'm going with your argument, yeah. But Paul, how does Paul imagine
I was getting to that.
Crucified man
I was getting to that.
rising from the dead that he hates, that he thinks cursed by God, appearing to him? I'm looking forward to that one.
Okay, go ahead, Bart.
So Paul did not get this information from Peter and James. Paul was persecuting Christians before he ever met Peter and James. So he knows the Christian claims already. There have been a lot of psychological analyses about what might have happened to somebody who feels guilt over what they're doing to these people that would generate a vision and to have a conversion. As you probably know, there are instances in which people who are enemies of Christ have visions in which they get converted. And so Paul would be in that category.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, Sundar Singh, by the way, would be a great example of this. This was an Indian that became a great missionary. He was burning Bibles. He was persecuting Christians in the early 1900s. And ultimately, he had a vision of Jesus, and he was transformed like Paul. But again, that happened after the Christian claim has already been made.
Yes, so did Paul.
For Paul.
So did Paul.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's exactly the same. So you can't say that it doesn't happen to enemies.
So you think he
because you
understood
just gave the example of an enemy where it happened.
So you think he understood the Christian claim clearly as he was persecuted?
He understood that they were saying Jesus got raised from the dead. Absolutely.
Okay. And then
why else is he persecuted?
And then he imagined on the Damascus Road.
I didn't say he imagined anything on the Damascus Road.
Well, what happened on the Damascus Road?
I just said that there are lots of options and we don't know because he doesn't tell us.
Okay. Well, he said he saw the Lord Jesus. That's what he said.
He said he saw the Lord Jesus. But what did where did he see him? When did he see him? How did he see him? How close was him? Did they talk? Did they spend a week together?
Seeing him's good enough, right?
He thought he saw Jesus. I've been saying that all along. He thought he saw Jesus.
I'm not expecting.
I'm asking why you don't believe him. Why do you think Paul's wrong?
Why don't I think a person got raised from the dead?
Yes.
Oh.
Why don't you think Jesus got raised from the dead?
I don't think anybody gets raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because it violates the laws of nature.
Okay.
I mean,
so you have the kind of a materialist, fundamentalist view.
Well, let me ask this. You think God raised Jesus from the dead, right? Do you think God can break the laws of mathematics? Can God
can't contradict himself, no. Because he is...
Exactly.
Mathematics is his language.
That's right. The other language he uses is physics. Can he break the laws of physics?
I mean, I think we're getting off.
No, we are not being. This is precisely. You asked me why I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics. And I don't think
he can
God,
feed things into his system, for sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Feeding things into his system to bring a dead person to life is not the same thing as making 2 + 2 5. That's completely different things.
They are both laws that have never been broken in history.
Except in the case of Jesus, right?
So here's the question. This is it's a very big question, because what you're arguing is that the most probable event that happens with Jesus, because Paul and Peter said it happened, the most probable thing is the violation of a law of physics that has never been violated in 13.8 billion years. Never. Except in this one instance. Now, if you're a historian, historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence to
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
not just
so?
that. Not just that.
When someone says, Paul saw Jesus, and that proves the resurrection, they're missing a critical point. Paul himself never describes seeing a physical Jesus. He only reports a vision. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists Jesus appearing to people, including himself, but never says it was a body anyone could touch. And let's be clear, Paul wasn't a neutral witness. He already knew the resurrection claim, so his experience, whatever it was, came after the idea was already spreading. Visions like this are well documented. People under intense guilt, stress, or trauma often experience vivid hallucinations, especially during radical life shifts. A 2019 meta-study on religious visions showed that many so-called divine encounters happen in similar psychological states. Bart's point isn't just theory. It's supported by research in bereavement psychology, where guilt and grief often lead to mental projections of lost or even resented figures. The Christian apologist's example of Sundar Singh, someone who also had a vision and converted, doesn't help their case. It actually proves Bart's. Emotional trauma can produce powerful religious experiences that feel real, but aren't evidence of a supernatural event. And Bart nails it. If you're claiming the only time in history that the laws of physics were broken was in one unverified event 2,000 years ago based on a vision, you're not doing history. You're asking for blind faith. And historians don't work that way.
We're just getting started.
What's interesting here for me, Bart, though, is that presumably on the face of it, if you do believe that God would never, if there is a God, let's say, that God would never break the laws of physics, then on the faces of it, no amount of evidence could persuade you of a miraculous claim. You've kind of decided that before you come to the text.
What you'd have to do is you'd have to have evidence from physicists that these laws don't apply.
Okay, so you'd have to go to the physicist rather than the historian.
You certainly could prove it, because physicists...
So we need to go to the physicists for the evidence.
Well, if you're going to say that the laws of physics have been broken one time in the history of the human race, then you need pretty good evidence. And the evidence that somebody said they saw somebody...
But that's not the only evidence, and we're going to talk about more. But that's not the only evidence. We were talking about the appearances, and the appearances, I think, and you've said this, and I've appreciated you said this in how Jesus became God. You talk about how basically the evidence is consistent with if Jesus did rise from the dead. And I appreciate that, because you're saying if Jesus rose from the dead, basically the evidence we have looks the same. It would look the same. So you don't believe he rose from the dead, but the evidence does support the miracle. Do you agree with that?
No, of course I don't.
Well, okay, consistent with the miracle. Is it consistent with the miracle?
Let me put it this way. There is a famous Jewish holy man, Baal Shem Tov, who eyewitnesses have told us, lived in the 18th century, he told us he could heal the sick, he could cast out demons, he could raise the dead. We have eyewitness accounts of this. And my suspicion is that you don't think it really happened, because you'd be suspicious of those reports.
I think the fact that nobody outside of Hasidic Jews think it happened is quite
okay. Who outside of Christians think that Jesus was raised from the dead?
Pinchas Lapid. He was a Jewish historian and scholar. He wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus. You should read it. It's actually really good. He actually was convinced by the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. Okay.
You should read it. It's really good.
I guess the point is, if you come to believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead physically, it's quite likely you will become a Christian. So
if you believe the miracles of Baal Shem Tov, then you become a Hasidic Jew.
And I'll also point out
so that is an evidence that Baal Shem Tov really did these things, because somebody believes and then converts. So it's not evidence.
And I would also add that there are scholars that I appreciate, people like E.P. Sanders. I know you respect E.P. Sanders. Like in Jesus and Judaism, the way he ends is basically saying, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But he admits the evidence is pretty strong. There's people that admit the evidence is strong, but they still don't go all the way.
I guess my question is...
I think the evidence, though, is strong. I don't think that's...
you haven't cited any all you've cited so far are eyewitnesses. And you've agreed that eyewitnesses in other cases don't work for you, including Baal Shem Tov. And so I'd like to know, why do you choose some eyewitnesses over others?
Again, nobody... This goes back to Moroni. Nobody outside of those few people believed Moroni appeared to them. Nobody outside of certain Hasidic Jews believed that Baal Shem Tov did miracles.
How about Mormons?
How about Christians?
How about Mormons?
I just said nobody believes those miraculous claims happen outside.
Yes, well, nobody outside of the Christian faith thinks that Jesus is the Son of God who was raised from the dead.
No. But people like Paul, for example, is an enemy that got convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Who is the Paul for Baal Shem Tov? Tell me who he is.
Well, there are a lot of Hasidic Jews who didn't start out as Hasidic Jews who read these stories.
But who's a Paul? Who's someone who was persecuting the Hasidic Jews and then got convinced by the Baal Shem Tov miracles? You bring all these people up, but it's insane. I mean, Jesus is completely unparalleled, completely different than all these rest.
You are a Christian. You've always been a Christian. Of course you think that Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And so I
You've almost said that you think Jesus is the most compassionate, the most influential, amazing person. You've said
I don't
things
think
close to that.
No, I don't. But so you're in the Christian tradition and you want to show that you're right. And, and so, okay.
I want to just demonstrate that Jesus is Lord because
this as a historian.
Died for our sins, and I want people to know that.
Exactly. Yeah. You're a theologian, and that's fine. I have no qualms with you as a theologian. What I have qualms with is you claiming that you're doing this on disinterested historical ground.
It's a historical religion. If it didn't happen in history, it didn't happen.
But if you're going to be a historian, you have to treat every religion equally, and not giving superiority to your particular faith.
But if you're going to be a historian, you need to be open-minded to miracles.
Yes, you're open-minded to everything.
No,
I am open-minded, yes. If you can show...
you said that the physics can't be...
I did say that.
Defied.
No. You didn't hear me.
Okay.
I said, you're saying it happened once in the entire human race. How many people have lived? I don't know how many people have lived on, billions of people. Mm-hmm. There are 8 billion people alive today. None of them is going to rise from the dead. How many people have risen from the dead? In your judgment, 1 out of, 20 billion who've lived or something. How many people have mistaken something they've seen? How many people have had a dream that they thought was something that was real? How many people have had a vision of a deceased loved one afterwards? Millions.
Right.
I mean, this is basically Hume's argument, isn't it? You know, against miracles. That essentially it's far...
So I'm different from Hume. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying that if you're...
So you're saying a historian can discover miracles in history then? You are saying that?
I wish you wouldn't put words in my lips.
Okay. Because I said you seem to be closed-minded.
Let me repeat it because I don't think you heard it. I'm saying that historians establish what probably happened on the past on the basis of probabilities. If the probability is 1 out of 800 billion or something versus 1 out of 8, what do historians think about that? Do they think it's more likely that the laws of physics are broken? Even they grant, okay, laws of physics, suppose they grant that. Do they say it did happen in this one instance because we have these 3 people who said it happened? Or do they say maybe they missaw something?
Okay. Justin, and then we'll move on to your next bedrock fact.
We talked about 107 billion people, that have walked the planet. That's fine. Out of those 107 billion people, how many of those people, those human beings, are worshipped by billions of people and called Lord and God today?
I don't know what the number is.
One.
So 107 billion. So how many? How many of those have been?
Let me finish my. Please let me finish my point. No. This is my turn.
Okay.
I'll
let you respond.
I thought you wanted me to respond to that.
Jesus is the only.
You
person.
asked me a question.
Okay.
You asked me a question. You wanted to know how many, and I was trying to answer your question. So may I answer your question?
Tell me someone else other than Jesus that's worshipped by billions.
I'm answering by asking you.
Oh no! See, that's not. You weren't answering the question.
Okay, I will answer the question.
So let me at least finish my point.
107 billion. You can't say that more people worship Jesus now. Therefore, he was raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because let me finish.
Let me finish my point. I was making a point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question, and I'm answering it now. Let me finish my question.
And then you come back.
You say 107 billion, and since more people worship Jesus now, that's evidence.
No, that's not what I said.
Then I
so let me finish.
Okay.
So I'm saying what we have here is an extraordinary, by exactly these exact odds that you're talking about, we have an extraordinary anomaly. We have one human being who walked this earth from the last, billions of years, and however long humans have been on the earth. Out of 107 billion, this one human being is worshipped by billions and called Lord and God. I'm saying that is an extraordinary anomaly. And so I'm saying that's something that historians would go, wow, that kind of is amazing. If Jesus achieved that extraordinary anomaly, 1 out of 107 billion on that point, maybe he achieved another extraordinary anomaly. Maybe he rose from the dead.
Okay.
Are you really using that as a historical argument?
I'm using it as an argument for the resurrection, whatever you want to call it.
What kind of argument would you call it?
Well, what's your problem with the argument?
But isn't it an extraordinary anomaly that Jesus is worshipped by billions? How is a crucified man...
No, it's not an anomaly at all. I wrote an entire book explaining how it happened.
Okay, how does a crucified man in his mid-30s, how is he worshipped by billions of people today? I mean, you don't think that's not an extraordinary anomaly?
It's not an anomaly. It's amazing.
By definition, mathematics, 1 out of 107 billion. But I'll let you finish.
Why is that proof that he was raised from the dead? It's proof that people are convinced he was raised from the dead.
I said it's a good argument against this idea that you were making that, you're telling me only one person out of all the 107 billion rose from the dead? A historian can't say that. That's not good enough evidence. Well, here's another point on that same person that is an extraordinary anomaly.
You can't explain that one. You can explain why there are so many billions of Christians in the world. It's not hard to explain, without a miraculous explanation. So why? I don't understand why you're arguing this.
But this single individual has had this kind of impact.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
So it's normal for crucified men in the ancient world that are Jews to be worshipped by billions and lay the foundations of Western civilization. This is normal.
You are not listening.
As Justin Bass grew frustrated and emotional, Bart Ehrman stayed grounded, calmly pointing out what actual historians rely on: evidence, not popularity or faith. Christianity's growth doesn't prove resurrection any more than Islam's global expansion proves Muhammad split the moon. Religious influence isn't rare. It's predictable. Sociologists and historians like Rodney Stark have shown that Christianity's rise was helped by social networks, Roman infrastructure, and centuries of political backing, not a miracle. In fact, mass belief in supernatural events happens across all major religions and cults, from Hindu milk-drinking statues to Marian apparitions. None of those are treated as historical facts, and neither should Jesus' resurrection. Bart also nailed the core problem. No credible historian would say a one-time violation of natural law is more probable than people being mistaken, especially when visions, hallucinations, and false memories are well documented in grief psychology. Studies show up to 60% of grieving people experience vivid visions of the deceased. That's not rare. What's rare is building a theology on it. So the real question is, do we rewrite physics for one ancient claim backed by a few biased followers? Or do we accept the far more likely explanation that stories evolved, beliefs spread, and people were wrong? What's more dangerous? Believing something because it feels good, or questioning it because it doesn't make sense? Let us know in the comments. Like if this gave you something to think about, and subscribe for more evidence-based breakdowns.